Which of these working?
You have to use the other microphone.
Oh, okay. Oh, I see. Oh, I see. This one. Oh, yeah, okay. Okay. So I can hold this like that?
Am I going to use this one?
Next to the other one?
Okay.
Okay, thanks.
Oh, thank you. For being wired.
Well, I have a carrying voice for work.
Yeah. Oh
my God. Like Dr. Evil.
Yeah, exactly.
I very probably am sitting on the microphone.
Yeah, there you go. Is that okay? Is it echoing? Is that okay, Rich? That's all right? Okay. Well, I think it would be only fair to start the next section of this by offering the floor back to Anthony, if you would like to respond to the last couple of points that Christopher made. And then
sure.
I have a question that I wanted to ask both of you, and then we certainly can open it up to questions from the floor.
Well, there are a number of things in that very rich and eloquent presentation by Hitch there that I'd love to respond to, but I'll pick out two, which I think perhaps the most significant. The first is on the question of the annihilating attack, the definitive defeat of Germany, the fact that the Germans must know that they've been, smashed, and they've got to start absolutely from scratch. One thing that struck me as I was working on the book was the fact that Roosevelt and Churchill had signed, only very shortly afterwards to rescind, a plan that had been put forward by the Secretary of the Treasury here in the United States in Roosevelt's administration, a man called Henry Morgenthau. This is known as the Morgenthau Plan. And this plan was devised against the background of much discussion, most of it which went on here in the US, about what to do about Germany after the war. And these discussions were of all kinds. They ranged from very extreme ideas that the German people should be sterilized so there won't be any more of them in future, to let's take all the German children out of Germany, put them into Australia and places where they could learn cricket, so that when they went back to England, they would, back to Germany, they would behave themselves. The idea was to try and extirpate Prussian militarism, to try to get rid of the culture that had twice plunged the world into war in a single generation. And Morgenthau's idea was that Germany should be deindustrialized, the Ruhr should be handed over to France and the Netherlands and Luxembourg and so on, and it should be divided into two purely agrarian countries, purely agricultural countries. Now Roosevelt and Churchill signed this, but they were told by their respective foreign secretaries, Henry Stimson and Anthony Eden, what a very, very bad idea this was. Eden pointed out to Churchill that a reconstructed Germany was going to be vital for Europe. It was going to be vital as a bulwark against the Soviet Union, because that was going to be the next big threat, and it was vital as a trading partner anyway for Britain itself. And so the idea was torn up. But the fact that it was put forward at all, the fact that it got as far as it did in the debate, speaks volumes really about a whole background of opinion that had its influence indirectly on the conduct of the bombing campaigns. Now, just before I get to the second point that I need to address, remember this, that we're talking here about one aspect of the bombing campaign, although it happened to be more than 50% of what the RAF did, and that is area bombing, deliberate attacks on civilians to massacre and terrorize civilians. That aspect of the bombing campaign was fueled by the sense that when you bomb a city, you don't only bomb the people in it, but you bomb the schools, the libraries, the concert halls, the archives, the monuments, the art galleries, the places where they make violins, places where they record music. In other words, you bomb the culture. In the book I call it culturecide, the idea that you could exterminate the culture as well as the people in order to smash it and start afresh. And this ties in very much with Hitch's idea about an annihilating defeat that would make it possible for them to start afresh and to do it right. And I think, as many people did during the war itself, in The Seed of Chaos, that wonderful pamphlet that Vera Brittain wrote, she makes the point that there were plenty of people in Germany who weren't supporters of the Nazis. As Hitch says, the city of Hamburg had been the center of opposition to Nazism, and yet it suffered the first very big attack, annihilating attack that RAF Bomber Command had mounted. And so what was happening was that the people who were going to be needed and the resources that were going to be needed, the clinics and schools and books and music halls that were going to be needed in the reconstruction effort afterwards, were being destroyed in the process. And so one has to put a question mark over that. That's the first point. The second point, I must take up the direct challenge about my 9/11 analogy. I was trying there very carefully by making the point about prescinding from other considerations, on which, by the way, I agree absolutely with Hitch. There's a very big difference between the British and the RAF that was carrying out that policy in 1943, 1944, 45, and Osama bin Laden and his criminal fraternity carrying out the 9/11 attack. Of course there is. That goes without saying. But the point that I wanted to make was this, that if you think it is a bad thing that anybody should try to kill and terrorize civilians, non-combatants, in order to coerce their government or to do harm to their polity by carrying out an attack of that kind, then you've got to be consistent and you've got to recognize that on that particular point there is a comparability between deliberately and systematically attacking civilians in cities, as we did in Germany and Japan during the war. So I'm going to stick with that argument.
Christopher, do you want to follow on that?
Very quickly, yes. If the bombing, or indeed if the war aim in general, because it would have been consistent with precision bombing as well, had been to impose the Morgenthau Plan, I don't think it would possibly be defensible. So I simply, in a way, want to signal agreement with Anthony about that, except that it was not the policy. It was I think it was actually disowned before the intervention of Sir Anthony Eden and others, because in my memory of reading the Churchill-Roosevelt correspondence of their meeting in Quebec, and so anyone can check this if they wish, it's the Quebec meeting, it's discussed. Roosevelt says, this is what Morgenthau thinks. What do you think? Churchill says, sounds like a good idea to me. They go on rather uneasily. And I think it reads to me like a competition, which of them is going to be the first to say, actually, did we just agree to that or not? Churchill is at any rate the first. He says, it sounds to me, I remember his words, he says immoral and unchristian. I don't see what's unchristian about mass murder, I have to say, but there you go. That's how some people talk. Anyway, it would have been also, by the way, a very, very much stiffer and wider opposition in Britain and America to this politically, and for the excellent reason that what it really is, the Morgenthau Plan, is a replay of the Versailles Treaty, the attempt to humiliate Germany and crush and squeeze its economy, about which Lord Keynes has very famously written his Economic Consequences of the Peace, and indeed an outcome for which many people, partly rightly, blame the rise of Nazism in the first place. So I think any attempt to repeat that blunder would have been met with a very stern and public and democratic opposition. But as it happens, we didn't have to worry about that. I'll just have to repeat a little more sternly, I think, the point about, and you didn't take me up on mutiny, but maybe you didn't want to.
On mutiny?
On telling them our guys should have disobeyed.
Oh, right, yeah, okay, I'll respond to that, because I have a point.
Because I can't believe that you would let it slide.
Yeah.
But on the second point, which was, I had it on your mind?
9/11.
Yes, look. The action of a non-state actor whose announced policy is not the rebellion against an empire, however crudely conducted, which is the case in your analogy with the Irish Republican Army or the Basque ETA, fighting, however criminally in their tactics for what they conceive of as the sufferings and losses of their people, but rather announced in advance by Al-Qaeda and its supporters as the attempt to impose an empire. In fact, to do worse than that, to rediscover and restore a lost and vanished empire, the Caliphate, on everyone in the world, to install a universal dictatorship, and to show that its means and its ends are exactly symmetrical, because it cares nothing for the life of anyone who isn't a true believer. This is not comparable to anything that the Royal Air Force did. It's just not to be mentioned in the same breath. And I've totally run out of patience with all the liberal and left excuses for this stuff. People who think that Osama bin Laden is some voice of the oppressed or cry of the unheard, that's all balls, okay? He wants East Timor given back to Indonesia, a little country that already almost suffered genocide at Indonesian Muslim hands.